Have you ever wondered if one of the most famous miracles in human history could actually be explained by science? The story of Moses parting the Red Sea has captivated believers and skeptics alike for thousands of years. We're about to dive deep into a mystery that has puzzled scholars, scientists, and theologians for millennia. And then, in a moment that would echo through history, the waters part, creating a dry path through what should have been certain death. If you're ready to explore the intersection of faith and science in one of history's most debated events. Instead, we're following the evidence wherever it leads, examining both the scientific possibilities and the spiritual significance of an event that changed the course of human history. The body of water that Moses and the Israelites crossed is called Yam Suf, which literally translates to Sea of Reeds. Not the Red Sea. We're talking about shallow, marshy areas where papyrus reeds would grow in abundance. Instead of looking at the main body of the Red Sea, researchers have begun focusing on the Nile Delta region. Scientists at the National Center for Atmospheric Research decided to take this linguistic discovery and run computer models to see if the crossing could be explained through natural phenomena. What they discovered was absolutely mind-blowing. Ancient lagoons that once existed near modern-day Lake Manzala, and even the Gulf of Suez, which is much shallower and narrower than the main Red Sea. These would be brackish lagoons, coastal marshes, or even ancient branches of the Nile River that no longer exist today. In what would have been the eastern Nile Delta during the proposed time of the Exodus. According to their research into ancient topography, this area once contained a branch of the Nile River that flowed into a coastal lagoon known as the Lake of Tanis. The two waterways would have formed a U-shaped curve, creating exactly the kind of shallow, reed-filled environment described in the original Hebrew text. Suddenly, the event becomes much more geographically and physically plausible, while still maintaining its miraculous character. This distinction isn't just academic nitpicking. It fundamentally changes everything about how we understand this event. The confusion began in the 3rd century BC when Jewish scholars were translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek. For reasons we still don't fully understand, they weren't just guessing or theorizing. They were using the same computer models that meteorologists use to predict hurricanes and that oceanographers use to study tsunami behavior. A sustained wind of 63 miles per hour, blowing from the east for 12 hours, would create a phenomenon called wind set-down. This isn't theoretical physics. Wind set-down is a well-documented meteorological event where strong winds literally push water away from one area, exposing the seafloor beneath. They chose to render Yam Suf as the Red Sea, creating a historical interpretation based on their understanding of the geography at the time. Whether you approach this from a position of faith, skepticism, or simple curiosity, the discoveries we're about to uncover will leave you amazed at the complexity and wonder of this ancient narrative. And make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this is going to be a multi-part journey that will challenge everything you think you know about the Red Sea crossing. But here's where it gets fascinating. When we imagine the Red Sea, we picture a massive body of water that stretches over 1,400 miles long and reaches depths of nearly 10,000 feet. At its widest point, it spans 220 miles across. The idea of 3 million people crossing such an expanse on foot seems impossible, even with divine intervention. But what if they weren't crossing the Red Sea at all? Modern atmospheric scientists, using supercomputers and advanced modeling techniques, we need to start with a shocking revelation that most people don't know. The Red Sea that you've been hearing about your entire life? It might not actually be the Red Sea at all. The original Hebrew text tells a completely different story, and this mistranslation has confused scholars and believers for over 2,000 years. Have discovered that under very specific conditions, sustained winds could actually create exactly the phenomenon described in the ancient texts. Did Moses really split the Red Sea through divine intervention? Or could there be a natural explanation that doesn't diminish the miraculous nature of the event? The answer might shock you, because recent scientific research has uncovered evidence that could change everything we thought we knew about this ancient account. But what if I told you that cutting-edge computer modeling, archaeological discoveries, and ancient weather patterns might hold the key to understanding what really happened on that fateful day when an entire nation walked through walls of water? We're going to explore not one, but multiple theories that could explain the Red Sea crossing. From wind set-down effects that have been observed in modern times, to volcanic eruptions that may have triggered massive tsunamis, to mistranslated ancient texts that could completely change where we think this event took place. And yes, we'll also examine those controversial claims about chariot wheels discovered on the seafloor and what professional archaeologists really think about them. This isn't just another retelling of a biblical story. Picture this: over 3 million Israelites trapped between the advancing Egyptian army and an impossible body of water. No boats, no bridges, nowhere to run. But that's just the beginning of this incredible journey. Type Y in the comments. Here's what makes this story so compelling. We're not trying to prove or disprove anything. But before we dive into the theories and evidence, in the ancient Hebrew manuscripts, this single translation decision has shaped centuries of thinking about the Exodus. The Sea of Reeds paints a completely different picture. This revelation opens up entirely new possibilities for where the crossing might have taken place. But here's where the story gets even more intriguing. Dr. Carl Drews and his team used sophisticated atmospheric and oceanic modeling to simulate what would happen if sustained winds hit these ancient water bodies. Their focus turned to a specific location about 75 miles north of the Suez Reef. When they ran their computer simulations, the results were stunning. The modeling showed that under these specific conditions, the water would recede enough to create a dry pathway approximately 2 miles long and 3 miles wide. The exposed area would remain passable for about 4 hours before the winds died down and the water rushed back in. That's enough time for a large group of people to cross, but not enough time for pursuing armies to follow safely. What makes this theory even more compelling is that it aligns perfectly with the biblical account in ways that researchers didn't expect. The Bible specifically mentions an east wind that blew all night, which matches the 12-hour duration needed in the computer model. It describes the water-forming walls on both sides of the crossing, which is exactly what wind set-down would create. And it mentions that the water rushed back suddenly, drowning the Egyptian army, which is precisely what would happen when the sustained winds stopped. But this raises a crucial question that we need to address head-on. If the Red Sea crossing can be explained through natural phenomena, does that diminish its miraculous nature? Dr. Drews, who is himself a Christian, doesn't think so. In his view, the miracle isn't necessarily in suspending the laws of physics, but in the perfect timing of natural events to accomplish God's purposes. The wind didn't just happen to blow at the right strength, in the right direction, for the right amount of time, at the exact moment when 3 million Israelites needed to escape. That level of coordination and timing still points to divine intervention, even if it worked through natural processes. This perspective opens up fascinating theological discussions about the nature of miracles themselves. Are miracles always supernatural suspensions of natural law? Or can they also be the perfect orchestration of natural events to accomplish divine purposes? The wind set-down theory suggests that both views might be compatible. Historical precedent supports the plausibility of this explanation. In 1789, Napoleon Bonaparte and his troops actually crossed a section of the Gulf of Suez on horseback during low tide. They nearly got swept away when the waters returned, but they successfully completed the crossing. This wasn't wind set-down, but it demonstrates that crossing significant bodies of water in the Red Sea region, under the right conditions, is historically documented. Dr. Bruce Parker, former chief scientist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has noted that Moses might have had knowledge of tidal patterns and weather conditions that allowed him to time the crossing perfectly. This doesn't require supernatural knowledge. Ancient peoples who lived near bodies of water often developed sophisticated understanding of weather patterns, tides, and seasonal changes that might seem miraculous to outsiders, but were actually based on careful observation over generations. The wind set down explanation also addresses some puzzling details in the biblical account that other theories struggle with. For instance, the text mentions that the Israelites crossed on dry ground, not just through shallow water. Wind set down would indeed expose the seafloor completely in the affected area. The description of water forming walls on both sides makes perfect sense when you understand how wind-driven water displacement works. And the sudden return of the water, catching the Egyptian army off guard, aligns with what happens when sustained winds suddenly stop. However, this theory isn't without its challenges and critics. Some point out that while the Bible mentions an east wind, the computer modeling suggests that a northwest wind would be more effective for creating the described conditions. But linguistic analysis of the original Hebrew reveals that the phrase ruach kedim can refer to either northeasterly or southeasterly winds, providing some flexibility in interpretation. Religious critics have argued that explaining the miracle through natural means diminishes God's power and reduces the event to mere coincidence. Ken Ham, a prominent creationist leader, responded to Drew's research by insisting that the parting of the Red Sea was purely supernatural and that there's no need to find naturalistic explanations for divine miracles. On the other side, some skeptics have dismissed the research as an attempt to prop up religious belief with pseudo-scientific explanations. Atheist blogger P.Z. Myers criticized the study, questioning whether it represented legitimate scientific inquiry or religious apologetics disguised as research. But Drews and his supporters argue that these criticisms miss the point entirely. They're not trying to prove or disprove the existence of God or the reality of miracles. They're simply investigating whether the events described in ancient texts are physically possible, and if so, how they might have occurred. The research doesn't require anyone to abandon their faith or their skepticism. It simply adds another layer of understanding to an ancient narrative. The wind set-down theory also raises intriguing questions about the knowledge and capabilities of ancient peoples. If Moses had timed the crossing to coincide with specific weather patterns, it suggests a level of meteorological understanding that we might not typically associate with Bronze Age civilizations. But archaeological evidence increasingly shows that ancient peoples were far more sophisticated in their understanding of natural phenomena than previously assumed. This brings us to another crucial aspect of the Red Sea crossing debate, the question of timing and location. The wind set-down theory works best if we accept that the crossing took place in the Nile Delta region rather than the main body of the Red Sea. But this geographic shift has implications for how we understand the entire Exodus narrative. If the Israelites crossed near the Nile Delta, it changes our understanding of their route out of Egypt and their journey to Mount Sinai. It affects how we interpret archaeological evidence and historical records. And it influences how we date the Exodus itself, which remains one of the most contentious issues in biblical archaeology. The dating question is particularly complex because it affects how we evaluate all other evidence related to the Exodus. Some scholars argue for an early date around 1446 BC, based on biblical chronology found in books like 1 Kings and Judges. Others prefer a late date around 1250 BC, based on archaeological evidence and references to the city of Ramesses mentioned in the Exodus account. This isn't just an academic debate. The dating affects which Egyptian pharaoh would have been in power during the Exodus, which archaeological sites we should expect to find evidence at, and which natural phenomena might align with the biblical timeline. If the early date is correct, we're looking at the reign of Amenhotep II. If the late date is accurate, we're dealing with Ramesses II, or his successor, Merneptah. The Merneptah stele, discovered in 1896, adds another layer of complexity to this discussion. This ancient Egyptian inscription, dated to around 1208 BC, contains the earliest known reference to Israel outside of the Bible. It boasts that Israel is laid waste and his seed is not, suggesting that the Israelites were already established in Canaan by this time. This archaeological evidence influences how scholars think about Exodus dating and, by extension, where and when the Red Sea crossing might have taken place. But the wind set down theory, compelling as it is, represents just one of several scientific explanations that researchers have proposed for the Red Sea crossing. Each theory brings its own evidence, its own challenges, and its own implications for how we understand this pivotal moment in human history. One of the most dramatic alternative explanations involves tsunamis and seismic activity. The basic premise is straightforward. When a major earthquake triggers a tsunami, the massive wave pulls water away from the shore before it strikes. This phenomenon, known as drawback, can expose vast areas of seafloor for brief periods. In theory, a well-timed tsunami in the Red Sea region could have created exactly the conditions described in the biblical account. The tsunami theory gained significant attention because it seemed to explain both the parting of the waters and their sudden, catastrophic return. Witnesses to modern tsunamis describe seeing the ocean floor exposed for miles as the water retreats before the wave hits. Fish flop helplessly on the sand. Boats sit stranded on dry ground, and people can walk across areas that were underwater just minutes before. When the tsunami wave finally arrives, it brings devastating force that could easily destroy an entire army. But here's where the tsunami explanation runs into serious problems. Modern reports indicate that the drawback period before a tsunami typically lasts less than an hour, sometimes as little as 10 or 15 minutes. The biblical account describes the Israelites crossing over a period of several hours, with enough time for millions of people to traverse the seafloor safely. The timing simply doesn't match up with what we know about tsunami behavior. There's also the question of survival. If the Israelites were crossing during tsunami drawback, they would have been caught in the same devastating wave that supposedly destroyed the Egyptian army. Tsunamis don't discriminate based on nationality or religious affiliation. The wave that would have drowned Pharaoh's chariots would have swept away Moses and his followers as well. Despite these challenges, some researchers have tried to make the tsunami theory work by connecting it to one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in human history, the eruption of Pharaoh, known today as Santorini. This massive volcanic explosion, which occurred sometime between 1600 and 1500 BC, was one of the largest eruptions ever recorded. The blast was so powerful that it completely destroyed the island civilization that lived there and sent tsunamis racing across the Mediterranean Sea. The Pharaoh eruption was a cataclysmic event that would have been visible and felt across the entire eastern Mediterranean region. The explosion sent a column of ash and debris high into the atmosphere, creating darkness that could have lasted for days or even weeks. The tsunamis generated by the eruption reached heights of up to 500 feet and traveled at speeds of over 200 miles per hour, devastating coastlines hundreds of miles away. Some researchers have proposed that the effects of the Pharaoh eruption could explain not just the Red Sea crossing, but many of the plagues described in the book of Exodus. The ash and debris could have caused the darkness that covered Egypt. Volcanic gases could have contaminated water sources, turning them red and making them undrinkable. The ecological disruption could have triggered swarms of insects and disease outbreaks. The tsunamis could have reached the eastern Mediterranean and even the Red Sea region, potentially causing the kind of water displacement described in the crossing account. This volcanic explanation is appealing because it connects the Exodus narrative to a real, documented geological event. We know the Pharaoh eruption happened. We know it was massively destructive. We know it would have affected the entire region where the Exodus supposedly took place. The question is whether the timing and effects align with the biblical account. But here's where the volcanic theory faces its biggest challenge: timing. Most geological evidence suggests that the Pharaoh eruption occurred in the 16th or 17th century BC. several hundred years before any of the proposed dates for the Exodus. Even if we accept the earliest possible date for the Exodus around 1446 BC, there's still a significant gap between the volcanic event and the biblical narrative. Some researchers have tried to bridge this gap by arguing for earlier dating of the Exodus or later dating of the eruption, but neither position has gained widespread acceptance in the academic community. The geological evidence for the eruption's timing is quite strong, based on ice core samples, tree ring data, and radiocarbon dating of volcanic deposits. There's also the geographic problem. While the Pharaoh eruption was massive, most evidence suggests that its tsunamis primarily affected the Mediterranean Sea rather than the Red Sea or Gulf of Suez region. For the volcanic explanation to work, you need to demonstrate a clear connection between the eruption and water displacement in the specific area where the crossing supposedly took place. This brings us to yet another controversial aspect of the Red Sea crossing debate: the claims of physical evidence discovered on the seafloor itself. Over the past several decades, various individuals and groups have reported finding chariot wheels, human bones, and other artifacts in the depths of the Red Sea, particularly in the Gulf of Aqaba. These discoveries, if authentic, would provide direct archaeological confirmation of the biblical account. The most famous of these claims comes from Ron Wyatt, an amateur archaeologist who reported discovering numerous chariot wheels, coral-encrusted bones, and other artifacts on the seafloor of the Gulf of Aqaba during expeditions in the 1970s, 1980s. Wyatt claimed that the wheels he found matched the design and construction of Egyptian chariots from the 18th dynasty, which would align with the proposed time frame of the Exodus. According to Wyatt's reports, he used metal detection equipment to locate gold-plated chariot wheels on the seafloor. He claimed to have photographed these artifacts and even brought some to the surface for analysis. The wheels, he argued, showed the distinctive spoke patterns used during the 18th dynasty period, with some having 4 spokes, others 6, and the royal chariots having 8 spokes. These claims generated enormous excitement among some believers, who saw them as definitive proof of the biblical account. If authentic Egyptian chariot wheels and military equipment could be found in the Red Sea, it would provide the kind of physical evidence that has been largely absent from Exodus archaeology. The discovery would validate not just the crossing itself, but also the biblical claim that Pharaoh's entire army was destroyed in the pursuit. But the archaeological community has been deeply skeptical of these claims from the beginning. Professional archaeologists point out that no peer-reviewed analysis of the alleged artifacts has ever been published. The photographs that Wyatt provided are often unclear and could easily show coral formations, modern debris, or natural rock formations rather than ancient artifacts. More damaging to Wyatt's credibility is the fact that he claimed to have made numerous other extraordinary biblical discoveries, including Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, and the crucifixion site of Jesus. The pattern of sensational claims without rigorous scientific documentation has led most scholars to dismiss his work as pseudo-archaeology rather than legitimate research. The chariot wheel story gained new life in 2014 when a satirical news website published a fake article claiming that Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities had officially announced the discovery of Pharaoh's army at the bottom of the Red Sea. The article quoted fictional archaeologists and described elaborate underwater excavations that never actually took place. Despite clear disclaimers identifying the story as satire, it was picked up and spread by numerous websites and social media accounts as if it were legitimate news. Professional fact-checkers and archaeologists quickly debunked the story, but it continues to circulate online, often without any mention of its satirical origins. The persistence of this false story demonstrates how eager some people are to find physical proof of biblical events, even when that proof doesn't meet basic standards of scientific evidence. Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of State for Antiquities Affairs and one of the world's most prominent Egyptologists, has been particularly critical of claims about Red Sea discoveries. He has stated unequivocally that no authentic Egyptian artifacts from the period of the Exodus have been found in the Red Sea, despite numerous underwater surveys and archaeological expeditions in the region. The absence of physical evidence doesn't necessarily disprove the biblical account, but it does highlight the challenges facing anyone trying to verify ancient narratives through archaeology. The Red Sea is a harsh underwater environment where organic materials would decompose quickly and metal objects would corrode beyond recognition within centuries, not millennia. Even if artifacts from an ancient army did exist on the seafloor, finding and identifying them would be extremely difficult. The Red Sea covers over 170,000 square miles, with much of it at depths that make detailed archaeological investigation challenging and expensive. Ocean currents, sediment deposits, and geological activity over thousands of years would likely scatter or bury any ancient remains. This leads us to a crucial question about the nature of evidence itself. How much physical proof should we expect to find for ancient events, particularly those that occurred in marine environments? The absence of artifacts doesn't prove that an event didn't happen, but it also means we can't rely on archaeology to definitively confirm the biblical account. Instead, we're left to evaluate the crossing narrative based on textual evidence, historical context, and scientific plausibility. This brings us back to the fundamental questions that drive this entire investigation. What kind of event are we trying to explain? Are we looking for a supernatural miracle that transcends natural law, or a remarkable confluence of natural phenomena that achieved miraculous results? And does the distinction between these two possibilities really matter for understanding the significance of the event? The more we examine the scientific theories and archaeological claims, the more complex the picture becomes. Each explanation has strengths and weaknesses. Each raises new questions even as it attempts to answer old ones. And each reflects different assumptions about the relationship between faith, science, and historical investigation. What emerges from this analysis isn't a single, definitive answer about how Moses split the Red Sea. Instead, we see multiple possible explanations, each supported by different types of evidence, each facing different challenges, and each appealing to different ways of understanding the intersection between the natural and supernatural worlds. The wind set down theory offers a scientifically plausible mechanism that aligns well with the biblical description, while maintaining the miraculous nature of the timing. The tsunami explanation provides dramatic visual parallels to the biblical account, but struggles with timing and survival issues. The volcanic connection offers a real historical event that could have caused regional disruption but faces chronological and geographical challenges. The archaeological claims promise direct physical evidence, but lack the scientific rigor needed for verification. Perhaps the most important insight from examining these various theories is that the question of how Moses split the Red Sea cannot be separated from larger questions about the nature of divine action, the reliability of ancient texts, and the proper relationship between scientific investigation and religious belief. These are not merely academic questions. They touch on fundamental issues of meaning, purpose, and truth that have shaped human civilization for thousands of years. As we continue this investigation, we'll need to grapple with these deeper philosophical and theological questions. But first, we need to examine one more crucial piece of the puzzle: the ongoing debate over when and where the Exodus actually took place, and how those questions affect our understanding of the Red Sea crossing itself. The question of when the Exodus occurred isn't just a matter of historical curiosity. It fundamentally affects how we interpret every piece of evidence related to the Red Sea crossing. Two major camps have emerged in biblical scholarship, each with compelling arguments and significant implications for our investigation. The early date theory places the Exodus around 1446 BC, during the reign of Amenhotep II. Supporters of this timeline point to specific biblical passages that seem to provide clear chronological markers. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 states that Solomon began building the temple in the 4th year of his reign. which was 480 years after the Israelites came out of Egypt. Working backward from the established date of Solomon's reign, this calculation points directly to 1446 BC. But here's where it gets fascinating. The early date advocates don't rely on just one biblical reference. They point to Judges chapter 11, where Jephthah tells the Ammonites that Israel has been occupying the land for 300 years. When you add this to the 40 years in the wilderness and trace it back through the chronology of the Judges, you arrive at the same 1446 BC date through a completely independent calculation. This consistency across multiple biblical texts is compelling, but it creates problems when we try to match it with archaeological evidence. The Late Bronze Age collapse, the destruction of Canaanite cities, and the emergence of early Israelite settlements all seem to point to a later period. Critics argue that if the Exodus happened in 1446 BC, we should see different patterns in the archaeological record than what we actually observe. The late date theory, favored by many mainstream archaeologists, places the Exodus around 1250 BC, during the reign of Ramesses II. This timeline aligns better with archaeological evidence of destruction and rebuilding in Canaan, and it matches the reference to the city of Ramesses mentioned in the book of Exodus. Ramesses II was one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, known for massive building projects and military campaigns that could explain the forced labor described in the biblical account. But the late date theory faces its own challenges. If the Exodus occurred around 1250 BC, how do we explain the biblical chronologies that seem to point to an earlier date? Late date supporters argue that the 480 years mentioned in 1 Kings should be understood symbolically rather than literally, representing 12 generations of 40 years each. They suggest that ancient chroniclers sometimes used round numbers or symbolic periods rather than precise historical dates. This dating debate has profound implications for the Red Sea crossing theories we've been examining. If the early date is correct, we're looking at different weather patterns, different sea levels, and different geographic conditions than if the late date is accurate. The wind set-down modeling, for instance, was based on reconstructed ancient topography that might be different depending on which century we're examining. The Merneptah stele adds another layer of complexity to this chronological puzzle. This Egyptian monument, dated to around 1208 BC, contains the earliest known reference to Israel outside the Bible. The inscription boasts that Merneptah has defeated various enemies, including Israel, which is described as being laid waste with no seed remaining. Early date supporters argue that this reference fits perfectly with their timeline. If the Exodus occurred in 1446 BC, and the conquest of Canaan began around 1406 BC, then by 1208 BC, Israel would have been well established in the land for about 200 years. The Merneptah stele would then represent an Egyptian military campaign against an already settled Israelite population, possibly during the period of the Judges. Late-date advocates interpret the stele differently. They argue that it represents evidence of early Israelite presence in Canaan shortly after their arrival from Egypt. In this view, the Merneptah campaign might have occurred during or shortly after the conquest period, when the Israelites were still establishing themselves in their new homeland. But there's a third possibility that some scholars have proposed. What if there were multiple Exodus events rather than a single mass departure from Egypt? This theory suggests that different groups of Hebrews left Egypt at different times, possibly over several centuries. Some might have left during the reign of Amenhotep II in the 5th century BC, while others departed later under Ramesses II in the 13th century BC. This multiple Exodus theory could explain why we have conflicting chronological evidence and why some archaeological sites show destruction in the 5th century while others point to the 13th century. It might also explain why the biblical account seems to combine elements from different historical periods, including references to cities that were built at different times. If this theory is correct, it raises intriguing questions about the Red Sea crossing itself. Did multiple groups cross at different times and locations? Were there several miraculous crossings that became combined into a single narrative over time? Or did one particularly dramatic crossing become the representative story for all the various departure events? The geographic implications of these dating theories are equally significant. Different proposed dates place the crossing in different locations with different environmental conditions. The early date might support crossing locations in the northern Red Sea or Gulf of Suez, while the late date might favor locations closer to the traditional route through the Sinai Peninsula. Recent archaeological discoveries have added new dimensions to this debate. Excavations at Tel Daba, the proposed site of ancient Avaris, have revealed evidence of a significant Asiatic population in the Nile Delta during the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period. These findings suggest that there was indeed a substantial Semitic presence in Egypt during the time frame proposed for early Israelite settlement. But the evidence is complex and sometimes contradictory. Some of the archaeological layers show signs of gradual abandonment rather than sudden departure. Other areas show evidence of destruction and rebuilding. That could support either date theory, depending on how the evidence is interpreted. The city of Pyrameses presents another piece of this chronological puzzle. The biblical account specifically mentions that the Israelites built the store cities of Pithom and Rameses for Pharaoh. If this reference is historically accurate, it would seem to support the late date theory, since the city of Rameses was built during the reign of Rameses II in the 13th century BC. However, early date supporters have proposed several explanations for this apparent contradiction. Some argue that the text was updated by later scribes, who replaced an original city name with a contemporary name that their readers would recognize. This kind of editorial updating occurred elsewhere in biblical texts, where ancient place names were replaced with more familiar modern equivalents. Others suggest that there might have been an earlier settlement at the same location that was later expanded and renamed by Rameses II. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site was occupied for many centuries before Rameses II's major building projects, so it's possible that Israelite laborers worked on earlier phases of construction that were later incorporated into the pharaoh's grand designs. The linguistic evidence adds yet another layer to this investigation. Analysis of Hebrew loanwords from Egyptian reveals that many entered the Hebrew language during the New Kingdom period, which would support the late date theory. However, linguistic borrowing can occur over extended periods, and the presence of New Kingdom Egyptian words doesn't necessarily prove that all Hebrew speakers were in Egypt during that specific time. Climate data from ice cores, tree rings, and other paleoclimatic sources provides additional context for evaluating these different theories. The Late Bronze Age was a period of significant climatic instability in the eastern Mediterranean region. Drought conditions, crop failures, and environmental stress contributed to the collapse of several major civilizations around 1200 BC. These climatic conditions could have created the perfect storm for the kind of social upheaval described in the Exodus account. Drought and famine might have motivated Egyptian pharaohs to release foreign laborers who had become economic burdens rather than assets. Environmental stress could have contributed to the plagues described in the biblical narrative. And changing weather patterns might have created the specific atmospheric conditions necessary for phenomena like wind set-down. But climate data also supports some aspects of the early date theory. The 15th century BC saw significant volcanic activity in the eastern Mediterranean, including possible eruptions that could have affected weather patterns across the region. These volcanic events might have created the atmospheric disturbances necessary for dramatic weather phenomena, including the sustained winds required for the wind set-down theory. The intersection of climate, archaeology, and biblical chronology creates a complex web of evidence that supports different conclusions depending on how the various pieces are weighted and interpreted. This complexity highlights why the Red Sea crossing remains such a contentious topic among scholars and why simple answers are so elusive. What's becoming clear is that our understanding of the Red Sea crossing cannot be separated from these larger questions about Exodus chronology and historicity. The scientific theories we've examined work differently depending on which century we place the event in, and which geographic location we identify as the crossing site. The wind set-down theory, for instance, relies on specific ancient topography that would have been different in the 5th–10th century BC compared to the 13th century BC. Sea levels, river courses, and coastal configurations all changed over time, affecting which locations would have been suitable for the kind of crossing described in the biblical account. Similarly, the volcanic theories depend on precise timing correlations between the Thera eruption and the Exodus events. If the Exodus occurred in 1446 BC, the volcanic explanation becomes much less plausible because of the chronological gap. But if there were multiple Exodus events spread over several centuries, one of them might have coincided with volcanic activity that could explain some of the miraculous phenomena. The tsunami theories face similar challenges. The seismic activity that could generate tsunamis in the Red Sea region varies over time, and different proposed dates for the Exodus correspond to different periods of geological activity. Recent research has identified several major earthquakes in the region during both the 5th, 10th, and 13th centuries BC, so the timing question remains open. Archaeological underwater surveys have attempted to address some of these questions by mapping ancient topography and searching for evidence of human activity on the seafloor, but these investigations face enormous technical challenges. The Red Sea is a geologically active region where tectonic movement, sedimentation, and erosion constantly reshape the underwater landscape. Even if artifacts from an ancient army existed on the seafloor, finding them would require knowing exactly where to look in an area covering thousands of square miles. Ocean currents would have scattered any debris over vast distances, and thousands of years of sedimentation would have buried most evidence beneath layers of sediment. The few underwater archaeological projects that have been conducted in the Red Sea region have focused primarily on mapping ancient coastlines and identifying submerged settlements rather than searching for specific artifacts related to the Exodus. These studies have revealed significant changes in sea level and coastal configuration over the past 3 millennia, but they haven't produced any discoveries that directly confirm or contradict the biblical account. This absence of direct physical evidence has led some researchers to focus on indirect approaches to the question. Instead of looking for chariot wheels or weapons, they're examining sediment cores from the seafloor to identify layers that might correspond to sudden influxes of sand or debris from the surrounding land. The theory behind this approach is that a massive event like the parting of the Red Sea would have left geological signatures in the sediment record. If millions of people crossed on dry seafloor, and then the waters rushed back in with catastrophic force, it should have created distinctive patterns of erosion and deposition that would be visible in core samples taken from the seafloor. Preliminary studies of this type have identified some interesting anomalies in sediment layers that could potentially correspond to major disturbance events. But the dating and interpretation of these findings remain highly speculative. The Red Sea's geological activity creates many natural disturbances that could produce similar sediment patterns without any connection to human events. This geological approach represents a promising new direction for investigating the Red Sea crossing, but it also highlights the fundamental challenges facing any attempt to find physical evidence for ancient events. The further back in time we go, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish between natural geological processes and the effects of human activity. As we grapple with these questions of timing, location, and evidence, we're forced to confront deeper philosophical issues about the nature of historical investigation itself. How much certainty can we reasonably expect when investigating events that occurred thousands of years ago? What standards of evidence should we apply to ancient narratives that combine historical, theological, and literary elements? These questions become even more complex when we consider the oral tradition that preceded the written biblical texts. The stories of the Exodus were likely passed down through generations before being recorded in their current form. During this transmission process, historical details might have been altered, symbolic elements might have been added, and separate events might have been combined into unified narratives. This doesn't necessarily mean that the core historical events didn't occur, but it does complicate our ability to extract precise scientific or archaeological data from the biblical accounts. The texts were written primarily as theological and moral narratives rather than scientific or historical reports, so they might not contain the kind of detailed information that modern investigators would prefer. The challenge is distinguishing between the essential historical core of these narratives and the literary and theological elements that were added to convey deeper spiritual truths. This distinction is crucial for evaluating scientific theories about the Red Sea crossing because it affects which details of the biblical account we should expect to find confirmed through physical evidence. Some scholars argue that the most important aspect of the Red Sea crossing narrative is not the specific mechanism by which the waters parted, but the theological message about divine deliverance and the establishment of a covenant relationship between God and the Israelite people. From this perspective, whether the crossing involved supernatural intervention, natural phenomena, or some combination of both is less important than the spiritual significance of the event. But other scholars maintain that the historical accuracy of the biblical account is inseparable from its theological meaning. In this view, if the crossing didn't occur in essentially the way described in the text, then the theological claims built upon that foundation become questionable as well. This tension between historical and theological approaches to the biblical text affects how we evaluate all of the scientific theories we've examined. Researchers who prioritize historical accuracy tend to favor explanations that can be verified through physical evidence, while those who emphasize theological meaning may be more open to explanations that preserve the miraculous character of the event, even if they can't be scientifically proven. The wind set down theory attempts to bridge this divide by providing a naturalistic mechanism that preserves the essential elements of the biblical narrative while making the event scientifically plausible. But even this compromise position faces criticism from both sides. Some argue that it reduces a divine miracle to mere meteorology, while others contend that it still requires too much faith and coincidental timing to be convincing. As we continue examining these different approaches and theories, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The question of how Moses split the Red Sea cannot be answered through scientific investigation alone. The available evidence is simply too limited and too ambiguous to support definitive conclusions about the specific mechanisms involved. What we can do is evaluate the plausibility of various proposed explanations, examine the strengths and weaknesses of different theories, and consider how new discoveries might shed additional light on this ancient mystery. The investigation itself reveals as much about our assumptions and methodologies as it does about the historical events we're trying to understand. This realization brings us to perhaps the most important insight of our entire investigation. The enduring fascination with the Red Sea crossing reflects deeper human needs and questions that transcend the specific details of any particular theory or explanation. We're not just trying to solve an ancient puzzle. We're grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the possibility of divine intervention, and the relationship between faith and reason. These are the questions that have driven human inquiry for millennia, and they're the questions that make the Red Sea crossing more than just a historical curiosity. Whether the waters parted through wind set down, tsunami effects, volcanic activity, or direct divine intervention, the story continues to capture imaginations and challenge assumptions about what's possible in our world.